All right, welcome back to the Nicomachean Ethics. We are in Book 10 still, and we've looked at the first chunk, that is chapters 1 to 5, talking about hedone, pleasure if you will. Chapter 6, we're going to pick up and return back to the question of eudaimonia. But just before we do, recall that hedone is kind of like a genus, which it has different species. And remember, Aristotle has notions of purity. The less associated with matter, the more pure the hedone. Hedone is also something that's supposed to be pure and independent, sort of all self-contained, one moment independent from the next. We'll get back into that a little bit later. But for now, all right, so we go back to this notion of eudaimonia, because that's what the whole thing, the Nicomachean Ethics, is all about. What does this term mean? Well, we've gone through a long discussion in all the other books. Check those videos out. But Aristotle in chapter 6 says, let's recapitulate a number of points. And these are largely way back from book 1. So eudaimonia, remember, it's an activity of soul. It's chosen for itself alone. But remember, we also pursue pleasures for themselves in and of themselves as well. You don't pursue the pleasure for the sake of something else. You pursue a pleasure for the sake of that pleasure. So in that way, eudaimonia and hedone is going to be linked up. We'll talk a little bit more of how they're linked. So they're linked, and so this is not unique to eudaimonia, that is, choosing it for itself alone. You also find that with hedone. Eudaimonia, as you recall from book 1, lacks nothing. It is basically self-sufficient. Here he wants to stress something, that although pleasure will be linked with, and hedone will be linked with eudaimonia, he wants to get rid of the notion that amusement is involved here. So often when we think about pleasures, we think about amusements. Like pleasures are things that are, fun, amusing. Aristotle says that's true, but that's not the kind of hedone that I'm talking about here. That's why I suggest you think of hedone as a genus. So there would be sort of like fun hedone, amusing hedone, and then higher level hedone. Eudaimonia is serious stuff. We're talking, Aristotle says, about the stuff, the most important thing in life. It's serious. He takes it very seriously, to the point, as we'll see in a moment, that he essentially privileges the notion of seriousness. In other words, there's a privileging of the very notion of tragedy over comedy, in a sense. Comedy in sort of the contemporary sort of amusement sense of that term, not necessarily in the traditional reconciliation notion. But it's serious things are just more important than funny things, according to Aristotle. So it's all serious stuff, this eudaimonia. So that's how we can get that trivial notion, or the trivial species of hedone, get them out of the way. Now, Aristotle, again, as we've seen in previous videos, one way he anchors this idea of virtue and what these things actually are, because life doesn't give us sort of a sheet that we just read them off. This stuff is not self-evident. Even the archai, the beginnings, the fundamental principles, they're not self-evident either. So Aristotle here, and we'll have a bit of tension with this in later chapters in Book 10, here Aristotle again invokes the notion of the good man. And the good man says, what's eudaimonia? Well, eudaimonia, again, is this pursuit of hedone, right, in conformity with arete. Basically, your happiness, really, if you want to put it in modern language, always be careful of that. Your happiness really is the pursuit of these hedone, of pursuit of pleasure in conformity with virtue. In other words, eudaimonia is going to be the pursuit of higher pleasures. So in other words, you could say that Aristotle does embrace a kind of hedonism. That, what's the meaning, what's the purpose, what's happiness all about? It is about pleasure, but certain kind of pleasure, right? So keep that in mind. So before you immediately jump to a conclusion, Aristotle thinks that life is really ultimately happiness, and that's connected to pleasure, and that's like, eating your favorite ice cream kind of pleasure. No, he does not think that. So the whole thing is going to turn on the understanding of the complexity of the notion or the concept of hedone and how it links up to eudaimonia. Okay, so back to this. We got the good man, which is kind of, we could say, very much a person, right? The good person. And sort of like, like the grandma, the grandpa kind of thing. Aristotle, of course, yes, he does probably, no doubt, leans towards men as playing this role, the wise men of your town. So these are very much a person, not an idealization. So it's very concrete where you get this stuff on eudaimonia. Remember, earlier Aristotle said that a person who's lived a long time and seems to be a really decent person would be able to give you life advice that you should take just as seriously as someone else who gives you life advice that's based on an argument. So non-argument, experientially based life advice could be just as good, according to Aristotle, as someone who, say, offers you advice and has this big argument that that leads up to the advice. So keep that in mind. And why I say to keep this in mind, particularly here, is there's going to be a bit of tension with this in his later view. That is, later things in chapters, well, we're in 6 here. I want you to think about if there's some tension with this good man concrete thing and what Aristotle says later on in chapters, especially 8 and 9. All right, so I mentioned that eudaimonia is serious stuff. Okay, so serious things. So here's just a simple statement that Aristotle makes, and he doesn't back it up. He just says it's just kind of a fact. We find it in the general population around us is that serious things are just more important than amusing and funny things, right? After a while, you stop laughing and giggling about stuff. It's time to grow up, says Aristotle, and be serious, right? And we do say that. Stop joking around about things. But that's an interesting point. Like, is it the case that serious things are truly more important? I mean, I always think of that when I see this from Aristotle. I'm always reminded of that quip by Oscar Wilde when he says, Oscar Wilde, the great 19th century writer, comedic writer, but an interesting thinker in his own right. He says that life is too serious, I wrecked the joke. Life is too important to be serious about. In other words, you have to joke about life because life is so serious. So, in other words, it's a questionable thing that serious things are more important than amusing and funny things. But anyways, this is something that Aristotle insists upon, and then he starts translating it kind of in how we should think about it in terms of ethics. The more noble a person, the more serious. And the more serious their activities will be, and the more productive of eudaimonia. So there is this link with being serious, real happiness, real eudaimonia, real nobility is, again, the domain of the serious. And he doesn't really tell us exactly what the domain of the serious is. But again, he's trying to get this trivial notion of hedone, like pleasures and bodily stuff. Get that out. That's trivial stuff. Towards the end of chapter 6, Aristotle makes this comment. He says, look, and we've seen him refer to slaves previously in the Nicomachean Ethics, and he will refer a lot to the concept of slavery in the Politics, but stay tuned for that. That's in a later video. He says slaves can enjoy bodily amusements just as much as anyone else. Right? So physically, the slave is on par. Animals, too. They can enjoy bodily amusements just like anyone else. A dog can enjoy eating just like we can enjoy eating some food. Our favorite food, a dog, too, can enjoy it. And slaves as well. But he says something interesting. And it really reveals his view, and he's going to explore it more on the notion of what slaves are, is slaves really don't even have a life. It's really not something that you can say is the life of a slave. It's not a true human life. And the really sad thing is that Aristotle thinks there's a concept kind of a natural slave. Pretty rough stuff, but it's there, and we have to examine what Aristotle says about it, and importantly, how it plays a role or what exactly it does in his thinking. But he does use these arguments here. He does use the notion of slavery as part of his story of what true eudaimonia is. All right, so slaves cannot have a life of their own. They don't have eudaimonia. That's not possible for them. So out of all this, Aristotle says, well, look, eudaimonia, it's going to be linked to hedone. So there is some sense of hedone, but not that trivial sense. Get that one out of the way. In other words, once we get the trivial notion, we have of a more advanced, a more subtle, a higher notion. And so eudaimonia in the end is going to be a kind of link to pleasure. That's important, but it's going to be a higher kind of pleasure. And what we're going to see Aristotle do is to unpack this. But what you want to be thinking about is Aristotle was talking way before in the early books about a very concrete notion of good and a very concrete notion of human life, and particularly human, but still concrete. So different than the animals, different than gods and all that, because we saw all his criticisms way back in Book 1, Chapter 6, about the Platonic notion of good. He said that's way too otherworldly for us. We want something that's uniquely human, uniquely in this world. Well, we seem to have it here with the good man giving us advice, being serious, not being a slave, not being an animal, but being intrinsically human. But the sort of the door that opens and should make you start to wonder is, what does he mean by this higher kind, and how high up does it go? Well, to answer that, stay tuned for the next video.